Well, good morning, everyone.
Hope you enjoyed your Thanksgiving holidays. It's time to begin our class today. Just a select group in here today. I know there's some sickness, some traveling. I'm not sure if today is the last one of these lessons or not. Apologies about that. It's partly a function of how far we go and partly other factors. So, anyway, I've asked Charles to lead us in a word of prayer before we begin this morning.
Father in heaven, we come together this morning to study from your word. We're thankful for all the many blessings that make this assembly possible. We're thankful for Jeremy and his willingness to teach the class this morning, and we pray that we can learn more about the bereavement process, how to handle it in our own lives, and moreover be able to offer better comfort to those who are bereaved. Bless us in our study this morning in Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you. If you're like me, it's been a couple of difficult days. If you have lost a loved one recently, it's hard not to think about all those memories at holiday times like this. So bear with me, please, this morning. I'm not completely, I don't feel completely in command of my thoughts and this lesson this morning, but we'll try and do our best. We spent some time thinking about bereavement, this idea of being forcibly robbed of a relationship with someone dear to us. We looked at the idea of grief being a very private emotion, the internal feelings we have due to that loss, the pain, particularly the emotional pain and trauma of that loss, and then the external expression of that, publicly, expressing typically with some things we're going to look at a bit more this morning, but outpourings of emotion. To mourn is the outward sign of what's going on inside us. And last time we spent a little bit of time thinking about the various emotions and feelings. This is partly to help each of us be better equipped to perhaps put ourselves in the position of those who have lost someone, to better understand what they're going through, or to remind ourselves of what we're going through. We'll look at some biblical principles, I hope, this morning that express the idea that we use what we've experienced for the benefit of others. I hope that's partly what's happening this morning in these classes. It's therapeutic for me. I hope that I'm going to be able to apply some of these things better to help others in the future. But shock, the very earliest feelings we have of a sort of emotional paralysis, a sort of a numbness, a feeling of disorientation, and we feel very, very different. Our emotions are in a very unstable state at that time. This idea of denial, this idea that we've got the heart side of us is still attached to the one that we've lost. And that attachment isn't broken. Meanwhile, our head sort of understands that it's happened. But because the heart is still attached, it interferes with the kind of rational side of us. And we kind of question whether it really happened. It doesn't really feel real because of the attachment we're experiencing. And we looked a little bit about the idea of attachment, this sense that we feel we need the love of a specific person on this earth. I'm not talking about our love of God, but I'm talking about our relationships with other people. We feel we need that relationship, that love from that person above all. It's valued above all. It might be a child, it might be a parent, grandparent, a spouse, a husband and wife. That's attachment. And we looked at the idea of David and Jonathan being described as having that knit soul. Their souls were knit together. and there was an attachment between the two of them. Abandonment, that's one of the other things that I can certainly feel associated with this sensation of feeling left behind. Not in my case feeling discarded, but that could happen when relationships break up sometimes between a husband and a wife. There's a sense of discarding. That's really this idea of abandonment, but certainly being cut off and separated from the one we love, physically unable to be with them. And so that's a strong emotion. And we finished up last week thinking about this grid. I put this together based on some things that I'd read. I'm not sure if it's going to help us or not, but let me try and walk us through it again. So we're going to look at the 4 different emotions that are on this grid in just a moment. But the idea is that as we move from left to right, we're looking at the past, things that have actually happened, and then we're looking on the right-hand side at a sort of a hypothetical future. That's how we are as people. Yes, we live in the present, but we're informed by things that have happened in the past. We're affected, changed by things that have happened in the past. And we also spend our time in the future, thinking about the future. So the very first thing here is sadness, and these 2 red lines that are pointing up and to the side, the idea is that there's an increasing intensity of these emotions. Sadness is an emotion, but there's a more intense kind of form of sadness on the right-hand side. Sadness is an emotion, there's more intense emotion above as we move up. So let's look at that. Again, we just wanted to notice that the Bible speaks about each of these 4 feelings. The first one of sadness, what we wanted did not happen. I think we can potentially relate to that idea of being disappointed in something. A disappointment creates a kind of a sadness, a regret. In this instance, do you remember what we said last week about Cleopas from that passage in Luke? What was he sad about?
It was already the 3rd day, and Jesus has not returned, and that they were looking forward to Israel being redeemed.
Yes, that's right. I'm not completely sure whether he expected the resurrection, but he certainly expected Jesus to be the one to redeem Israel. And he was sad. He was disappointed. What he wanted was to see that happen. And it didn't happen as far as he was concerned. I mean, in a sense it did happen spiritually, but he wasn't looking at it like that. And so there's a regret and disappointment that the redemption of Israel in his eyes wasn't accomplished. Sorrow, what we want cannot be. So in the one case, we're looking backwards with sadness. The sorrow is looking forward. What we want cannot be. We live our lives with hopes, dreams of the future. And when they collapse, that's sorrow. That is this sense here of longing. There's also a possibility of guilt here. Can you imagine how guilt could play into this idea of what we want cannot be? Especially with the idea of bereavement.
Things maybe you wish you could have done.
Yes.
Or said, or...
Yes, absolutely. This is quite a common feeling that there is things undone, unfinished business, you might say, unfinished communications, unresolved conflicts, undone kind deeds, undone words of teaching, correction, encouragement, whatever you can imagine. There's a real pain associated with longing for what we would have done in the future that cannot be now. It can't be. So this picture of Acts 2:37, you can probably, without even turning to it, think about what's happening there. How is sorrow being manifested in that situation?
They ask what can they do
Yes.
change the situation or
Yeah.
to be saved.
They suddenly realize they have crucified their Messiah. And what they want, which is not to have crucified the Messiah, instead to embrace their Messiah and to believe and obey their Messiah, in that moment their feeling is it cannot be. Well, it can be, thankfully. There is a way for that to happen. But that was their initial reaction. And Paul, there's something going on there in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 4. Someone like to turn there and maybe just read that?
Longing to see you, even as I recall your tears, so that I may be filled with joy.
Okay. How does that relate to this idea of sorrow, would you think?
Well, they separated at some point in time,
Yeah.
and the possibility Paul or Timothy living to see each other again,
Yeah.
that they probably, well, I think they were very close to bond.
Yeah. I'm sure both men would have wanted to be with each other, see each other again. Could not be. So there's sorrow. So can you see the sense that sorrow is a bit like sadness, but sorrow looks forward, sadness looks back. Sadness is one level of emotion, but there's a whole higher level of emotion, a deeper, more intense emotion with sorrow. Okay, let's carry on. Anger. We did not get what we wanted. So can anyone here perhaps relate to that with regard to either your own personal situation or maybe someone you know, situation you're aware of?
Even in small things, sometimes you get angry.
Okay.
It didn't.
Yes.
And so yeah, very relatable.
Yes. So imagine this scenario that you have a child who's killed by a drunk driver. So there might be a sense of anger associated with that. How might that arise? Can you imagine? Maybe someone here has experienced something similar to that. I don't know whether Alma was talking about her sister and whether that was...
It's not something I experienced as far as feeling anger like it was the driver, but I've read of people being angry towards God.
Yes.
Blaming God. Why did you take me?
Yes.
And so on. Or even blaming the person.
Yes.
Maybe they weren't careful in doing something and
That's
that
right.
caused the death. Or maybe somebody didn't seek treatment and they died. And
Yes.
so you're angry because they did not seek treatment, or they didn't make a right choice and they died. So there's different ways for anger to be here.
In Genesis 4, chapter 5, verse 5 there, Genesis 4:5, what did Cain want? Do you remember? Again, you probably can remember without even turning to the passage. What made him angry? Do you remember?
Because Abel's sacrifice was accepted.
Yes. It could well have been, if you like, the comparison between how his sacrifice was received or not received versus Abel's. But it could also have been something just as it didn't get acknowledgement, it didn't get kind of the recognition that he expected it. This idea of that we've been wronged, I think, is a central idea in anger. And so in bereavement sometimes we might feel that we've been wronged, either by the actions of somebody else like we've just been talking about, or somehow God is unjust, that we've been wronged, that being robbed of a loved one in a situation.
Jeremy, the other situation, and David brought it up, about his mom taking her own life, and I wasn't angry per se, but I was like, she cheated my children of a grandmother, type of attitude, and then the way she left things in disarray. The kids didn't know what to do, what to feel. They couldn't even just talk to her or iron things out. And
Yes.
They could do nothing. It's
Yes.
just ended.
Yeah. So it's partly we feel we've been wronged, partly because of what we feel entitled to, what we feel should be ours. You know, our rights, our situation has been violated, if you like, in some way. We're wronged. How did Jacob feel wronged by Laban?
He was deceived in thinking that he was getting Rachel or Rebecca.
He was going to get Rachel in his.
And he was substituted.
He was tricked. That's right, and in other ways as well. He was angry about what else? Do you remember? What did Laban do as well as tricking him out of Rachel?
Cheating him on his wages.
Yes. Changed his wages 10 times, it says. So, you know, he would have felt wronged. His rights were violated, if you like. The sense of justice and fairness was violated.
He also made him work in extra. So
Yes, he did.
He was right.
That's right. So anger is, as far as I'm saying, again, I'm not offering any of this from a psychological kind of background, but it does seem that it's rooted in the past. Things have happened, and a violation of what we consider to be what is right. And we have been wronged in some way, and anger results in us not getting what we wanted, which was, you know, what is right and fair in our mind. It may not be correct, but in the way we look at things. And even God himself is angered when he does not get what he wants. And that's expressed there in Hebrews. So that's the past. And then here, fear. Fear. What we do not want to happen. So we're spending time imagining potentially bad outcomes, bad situations. It's kind of related in anger in a sense to anger in a sense, because some of the same possible wrongs, violations, injustices, deprivations could be occurring, but we're imagining them, we're thinking ahead. It's hypothetical at this point, it's the future, it hasn't happened, it may never happen, but we fear. And so someone would like to turn to John 19 verse 38. How is there fear in that situation?
At 1938,
Yeah.
after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but a secret one for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. Pilate granted permission. So he came and took away his body.
What was the hypothetical in that situation? What was the bad situation that he might have been imagining?
Persecution.
Yeah, being put out of the synagogue, being persecuted more severely than that, maybe even threatened with his life, doing something like that. It hadn't happened. He was imagining what they could do, and because of that, he came at night. Sylvia, did you?
Oh, that's, yeah, he could
Yes.
just kill Jesus.
Yeah. What about in Acts 22, verse 29? What's happening there? Why is there fear in that situation?
Is that what it was?
What's that?
Is that where he tied up Paul and found out he was a Roman?
Yes, yeah. The Roman commander discovered that he had just broken Roman law. There had been a severe punishment for that. It hadn't happened. It was a hypothetical. It might well have happened. I mean, he might have been able to talk his way out of it. I don't know. There might have been some leniency, possibly, but he was frightened about this bad outcome when he discovered that Paul was a Roman. He had bound him. So fear is in some ways, I would argue that it's a more intense emotion than even anger, because fear somehow lingers. It's anger can express itself and blow out fairly quickly and pass. We can't maintain an angry state for hours or days or weeks on end. It isn't like that. It's just a different type of emotion. Whereas fear, we can live in constant, if we choose to, constant anxiety about bad outcomes that may never happen, but we're fearful of them. And so I'd suggest it is a more intense feeling. Yes.
You know, from a psychological viewpoint, you know, a lot of people don't handle the surprises very well at all. Even though God says, don't be surprised, they're coming, they try to protect themselves by being suspicious or negative. And, you know, the gospel is trying to protect you from both things. It's trying to allow you to not have to live angry or suspicious, and at the same time protect you from the surprises themselves. You know, in Job 3:25, he says, "For the thing which I greatly feared has come upon me, and that which I was afraid of has come unto me."
Yeah, that's a great passage. Yeah.
I don't know how much we bring upon ourselves by fearing, if that's a possibility, but obeying God is protecting us no matter what.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great verse. I remember that one. So, some people would suggest that in the process of grieving, each of these four emotions has to be processed. I think there's now an acceptance from what I could read that each of these four doesn't necessarily come in some defined sequence. I think there was a time when people felt that you would move from one to the other, to the other, to the other. I think that isn't necessarily an opinion. It wasn't my experience, I can certainly say that. The other thing is that some people talk about all of these have to be experienced and processed. So I'm just going to share my thought, and then I'd like your thoughts if you'd like to share any. But I never felt any anger when Beth passed. I honestly didn't really feel I had anything to be angry about. I didn't feel my rights had been wronged, or you know, I was obviously, yes, there was a sense of my plans, my hopes for the future had collapsed at that point, but I didn't feel angry about that, and I've wondered for some weeks and months afterwards whether there was something, whether I was really kidding myself, whether I really was angry. But I've come to the conclusion I really wasn't. So I'm just going to share with you, as far I have all the other sensations, all of those other emotions I've had at various times, still having some of them. But I just wanted to turn that over to you, whether you've had any similar situations, or whether you feel like you have experienced each of these, whether you felt there was a sequence to it. Just anyone like to share?
Well, little kids that come in foster care, you know, they're robbed of their parents. No matter how bad their parents were, they still go through this whole same process. But anger was a pretty common thing.
Yeah.
Even though they didn't, you know, go into a rage, but it was beneath the surface, at least little things set them off, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it kind of seemed like it never did go away.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
One of my brothers took his life, and I think I had visited him in the hospital one time after he had tried, and I asked him why, you know, and he's like, well, I didn't think I'd be here to give an answer for that. And so he tried, obviously, more, and finally went ahead with it. And I think I was all of these because I was angry just because he did that and like what it did to the family.
Yeah.
And then fearful that this could happen to anyone.
Yeah.
At any time. Like someone could go down this road.
Yeah. There's certainly a lot of counsel out there that suggests that if we have any of these four emotions, we should really acknowledge them, kind of embrace them, and not to kind of push them down, bury them in ourselves, because that will eventually be counterproductive. They'll come out one way or the other. It's a bit like your sins. Be sure your sins will find you out. These emotions will come out at some point in an uncontrolled fashion, unpredictable fashion. Better to try to acknowledge them and work through them. And that's not the purpose of this class, is not to talk about how to work through them, but just to acknowledge, for those that maybe haven't recently experienced bereavement or have had different experiences, at least being aware of what someone in a bereaved state might be feeling, especially very early on in the situation. I'm going to put this all up on the church website when we're done with this, if you want to think about it some more and look at some other thoughts. I want to talk about acceptance. I want to talk a little bit about what it means to kind of work through this. I can't speak to this from the personal point of view yet. I'm still working through my real acceptance, which is, I suppose one definition is that we finally accept the reality of everything that's happened and the permanence of everything that's happened. If you want to kind of wrap it up, there's a lot more to it than that, but some of these other thoughts here, embracing the pain and expressing it, is part of acceptance. In other words, just as we said a moment ago, not burying all of those things. We might know somebody or have someone in our close circle or family who's experiencing this. If they have buried these things, there may not have been a full working out of the acceptance. Accepting the new phase of life, accepting and recognizing what we've lost in the loved one that has gone, whether it's a spouse, a brother or sister, a child. We have. It's going to change our lives. We talked about that in the very first lesson, how instantaneously nothing is the same, and it's really accepting that our life is something different now. That was the life then. Now there's the life going forward. They're not the same, and we're accepting that we're in a new phase. Beginning to look more forward than back. How do I know that I'm still processing acceptance for myself? Because I still spend a great deal of time looking back, thinking back. There will no doubt be a time, I hope and trust there will be a time when I'm spending more time looking forward. It's not that I'm ever going to forget, and it's not that I'm going to diminish what's already happened, but I can begin to invest more of my thoughts and my energies in looking forward. Redirecting our attachment to emotional connections with others. We're going to look at something in just a little bit about our relationships with people. But when we've lost someone, whether it's a spouse, a child, there's a loss of that emotional connection, and we as a relational people, creatures that desire relationships with others, we're going to need those emotional connections, and we begin to find them in other ways. Not the same, but in other ways. Continuing to love our absent one without dependence on their presence. If that makes sense. So the attachment remains, but they're not here. We still love them, even though they're not here. They don't have to be here for us to love them. And then shifting our focus from ourselves to others. I've wrestled with the last several months, at times feeling that I'm being self-indulgent, if you like, to dwell on these things and process these things and think about my own situation or immediate family situation. I think we'll look at some passages, I hope, in Ecclesiastes that help us understand that there's a time for certain things, there's a time for other things. It's not necessarily wrong. It would be wrong just to stay in that state. And so part of acceptance is we begin to move away from just dwelling on our own loss and our own feelings and begin to move towards others. And in thinking about all of this, it struck me, maybe, I hope this is not a reach, but I think there's some parallels here between what happens to us when we move from spiritual death before becoming a Christian to spiritual life, becoming a Christian. We acknowledge a permanent loss of our old self. We put ourselves to death. And there's some level of grieving. I mean, it was in my case, perhaps in your case too, when you become a Christian, I grieve over what I was before I was a Christian. Perhaps you've had different experiences than that, but Paul talks about some of those things in 1 Corinthians. We have a new hope, a new life. We talk about entering a new phase of life, acceptance being recognizing that was a different kind of life then, and now there's a different life ahead of us. That's our lives as Christians. We have a living hope. It talks about there in 1 Peter. Again, we look more forward and less back. What's Paul talking about in Philippians 3:14? Do you recall?
So Jesus forgetting what was behind and looking forward.
Yes, yeah. And so forgetting, I mean, in the sense, Paul, the context of what he was talking about obviously had a lot to do with his status as a Jew, as a high-ranking Jew who was giving up a lot from an earthly, worldly point of view, and so he was forgetting all that in a sense. But the broader principle is that he was putting to one side his old life, and he was now looking ahead and shifting his focus to the future. And then, as Christians, we are encouraged to think about others, think about our brethren, especially move the focus from ourselves, shift it to others, especially our brethren. And so I just thought that it might help you, it helped me a little bit to realize that moving from life, to death is a bit like, in some ways, moving from spiritual death to life. There are some similarities in the whole process of acceptance of what has happened. Did anyone want to comment on that before we moved on? Yes.
When I was young, in a very short period of time, I lost my uncle, my grandfather, and my cousin for different reasons. And it changed my life. And I was trying to make sense of it. And there was a song that helped me that we would sing at church. And it's When My Love for Christ Grows Weak. And it talks about the worth of pain. And so I thought a lot about that over the years. And it does have a value. How we come into that, it's not really enjoyable. But on the other end of it, it does have value.
Yeah. That's a very profound thought. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure, question. So, as you're taking us through this, is this acceptance then part of that healing process, or is this just a change of course? What are we looking for when we say acceptance?
Well, this is more of an opinion. I'm just expressing my thoughts for what it's worth. I tend to feel like this acceptance is a point you can describe by various attitudes and behaviors that sort of indicates that we've come to terms with what's happened, and there has been a degree of healing and processing of all of the pain and trauma of loss. It's not forgotten, it's not buried, but it's seen in a different light, in a more constructive and positive way than to begin with.
Sometimes you see people who never make it to this step.
Yeah.
They're still locked in either fear, anger.
Yes.
They'll be locked in anger, they're locked in
Yes.
fear, and they haven't stepped past that.
Yes.
Grown, work through that mentally to come to this particular point in life. So
Yes.
would you say that person is dead themselves? I mean, they have given up on life, is that what
Well,
we see?
I'm not sure exactly how I would answer that, but
I know, I'm
but-
trying to process that
yes.
myself, you know.
I think that I would hesitate to really express much of an opinion about that. I was aiming in presenting this material to help us recognize signs, if you like, of a healthy processing of what has happened. When we can get to the point of being able to embrace the pain, being able to accept that we're in a new phase of life, beginning to look forward more than back. These are all signs of a healthy processing of the bereavement.
I was just thinking, my sister's death was sudden. My mom's death, she had been sick for a long time. But with my sister, one of the things that hit me the most, and I said it earlier, is that just the fact that I wouldn't ever see her or talk to her, that was painful. But then with the birth of the new baby, I was able to shift. My grief was not as intense anymore because of the joy of the baby and the joy that they gave me. But when my sister first died, I remember feeling guilty for being happy.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I shouldn't be happy, my sister just died.
Yes.
And there were moments when I forget about it for an instant,
Yes.
but then it would come back immediately and it would bring me down to earth. Oh, I shouldn't be happy. It's irrational thinking, but it's things that you think about. But with my mom, she had been sick for a while and then bedridden, and then she was in my home and hospice. So when she passed away, it was more a relief because I knew she was in better hands in care than I could ever give her. And so it was totally different emotions
Yes.
from the sudden death of my sister to the expected death of my mom.
That's what we were saying in the first lesson, that the circumstances surrounding the loss of this loved one are all so very different. It's going to affect how we feel it. But in some way or other, maybe not all of these, but some of these features will be present in a healthy acceptance of what has happened. Okay, just wanted to quickly go back to this idea of some biblical principles. So I just find it very interesting that there were days of mourning. there were in the Old Testament, and it's really not explicit anywhere in any passage of law, but more traditional it seems. Sometimes they made a mourning for 7 days, sometimes they made a mourning for 30 days. But there were days of mourning. In other words, days of outward, public expressions of this grief. And as we may have mentioned in passing in the first lesson, that we live in a society that's kind of pain avoiding. And we compress the mourning process, or often compress it into a short package of time, and there's almost an expectation that we should now move on, But it seems that people were allowed more time to mourn from a biblical point of view, and that's just a thought for us to contemplate our own situation of mourning.
As you've been going through this, something that's just gone through my mind so much is we tend to have a funeral within days, within 2 or
Yes.
3 days. And then we're past it,
Yes,
but we're not.
that's
And
right.
I look at these days, which are much longer than that. And so from my perspective, understanding that grief is very personal, this is what you're talking about. And I hope you'll get into this time, the things that were most helpful to you, because that's, at least at this standpoint, until I experience what you experienced,
Yeah.
the trying to figure out what to do to help is a real challenge, because grief is so personal.
Yes.
And to not step into the personal space, but to help.
Yes. And then the other thing I noticed here, what's the common denominator here in these verses, would you say?
Weeping.
Yes.
Deep.
Yeah, it's just a lamentation, a weeping, a wailing. It's very, very open. I mean, sometimes we see Middle Eastern cultures still acting like that, but we don't see it in our culture. But this is how God's people, these are God's people, this is how they expressed and processed bereavement in a very outward way. I know that we all have different personalities, and I'm not necessarily suggesting that we're not grieving or mourning properly. I'm just really pointing out that that's how God's people mourn. So, actually, I thought I had another comment there. Well, yeah, I can't find it. We'll carry on. So, I wanted to think about a few thoughts. This is not quite exactly what Sylvia is talking about, but I hope this will potentially help us. And again, thinking about these being available, if you don't use the website, I'm happy to make this available in other ways. But I wanted to focus on, if you like, this chain of ideas here. We have God's comfort. Where does God's comfort come from for us? I would suggest for us that it comes initially from recognizing His character. Psalms 12:6 talks about the purity of His words, the fact that there's utter truth, utter righteousness. That there's no ulterior motive. It's all about His love and His goodness, the purity of His word, and because of that, we can then move to what He says. If we believe God's character is a particular way, we can then rest on what He says based on His character. You and I both know that if we are given an assurance by someone, but we really don't value their integrity, it's worthless. It's absolutely worthless. The promises, the commitments, the assurance is only as good as our view of their character. That's my point here, that we start. I've been trying to get to the point where I can read God's promises and remember who God is, so that those promises really strike home. Because if I just superficially skim over those promises, it doesn't do anything for me. I have to think about who God is, who His utter dependability, His concern and love for each of us. And so we go from His character to His promises to the hope, because He promises some things, so therefore there are some things out there in the future I can hope for because of His promises, and I can believe His promises because of His character. And then if I have this hope, I have an assurance. I have a reason to have a confident expectation of something. And so each one of these characteristics builds upon the other. And we get to a point where we can read some of God's promises. And that's what I wanted us just to do this morning. There is comfort in these promises. I'm not sure if I shared this in previous lessons, but I know we have our church Bible reading program. I hope the elders will forgive me for saying this, but I couldn't process doctrinal passages and some of the scripture of a certain character when Beth first passed. I found myself in the Psalms. It's the only place I could find the comfort, the emotional support, promises, like this one, binding up the brokenhearted. Each of us has had our hearts broken in different ways. That's his promise. This one is one that the surgeon and I talked about after Beth passed. He came into the room, the side room. You know something's bad when they take you into the side room, out of the waiting area. And so we talked about this. God working all things together for good for those who love him. How is that going to do us any good if we don't really believe who God is? What he can do? His purity of motive, his capabilities, ultimately his love and concern for us. And what is good? I mean, what we think is good is one thing, but what is good is another. These passages in Psalms 37 and Galatians 5 are sort of connected, I think, because in some ways God promises to meet our needs and our desires, but not just any desire that we have. We are taught in Galatians 5 about the fruit of the Spirit, that there are desires that change when the Spirit of God is influencing us. Our desires are going to be God's desires, increasingly. Those are the desires he's going to meet. He knows what is good for us. He's not going to just meet desires that aren't necessarily good for us. I'm watching the time here. I need to wrap this up. But we'll just return to this. But these promises, they're helping me. They don't wipe away, maybe for you as well, they don't just wipe away every doubt, every uncertainty, every sadness, every sorrow, every fear. But they begin to give us anchors, I believe, to help us keep going and to trust God.
I was just thinking that, your logical mind accepts all these scriptures, but when it first happens, nothing's comforting.
That's right.
You just don't feel comforted.
Yes.
But, and in time, all these scriptures will come back to
Yes.
you, around you, but at the beginning, it's just no words.
Exactly. So we'll carry on with this. I think there'll be one more week. I'm sorry I wasn't very sure about exactly how far we would get. We'll wrap this up now, but I do want to just continue next week with some of these promises. At the end of this, after next week, we'll post this, and I'll make it available for anyone who wants to look at this material in more detail. Thank you so much this morning.
Appreciate you, Jeremy. Touching stuff, man. Probably the only one who can teach the class like this right now.